It hung on the door of Miller's General Store in Copper Falls, Montana Territory, tacked up with a single nail that had rusted through 2 winters already. The paper had curled at the corners from the cold, and someone had bumped it crooked, so it sat at an angle that made you tilt your head to read it straight. Nora Hartwell read it 3 times. She stood in the November sleet with her coat pulled tight across her stomach, a stomach so large now that the buttons at the bottom could no longer close, and she read that small, crooked notice while the cold found every gap in her clothing and the mud at the edge of the boardwalk soaked through the sole of her left boot, which had been coming loose since Bozeman. Help wanted. Cook and housekeeper. Live-in position. Mountain residence. Monthly pay. No experience necessary. Inquire within. She had read notices like this before. In Fort Benton twice. In Helena once. Each time she had walked through the door with her back straight and her hands steady, and each time the man or woman behind the counter had looked at her stomach and then looked away and said the position had already been filled, or that they needed someone who could start immediately, or sometimes nothing at all. Just a slow shake of the head that required no explanation. She was 28 years old. She was 8 months along. She had $11.40 in the inside pocket of her coat, a pocket she had sewn there herself because the original pockets had holes she had never gotten around to patching. She pushed open the door of Miller's General Store. The bell above the door announced her arrival to a room that smelled of tobacco and dried meat, and the particular sweetness of sugar kept in open barrels. A pot-bellied stove squatted in the corner working hard. Behind the long counter a man with a white beard and the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had been standing in the same spot for 30 years looked up from a ledger. He was perhaps 65. His eyes were sharp in a way his body was not, and they moved from her face to her stomach and back to her face without pausing long enough to be rude. "The notice outside," Nora said. "The cook position. I'd like to inquire." The man set down his pen. He studied her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between amusement and something more serious. "You read the whole notice?" "I did." "Mountain residence," he said. "You understand what that means up here this time of year?" "I understand what it means." He leaned forward on the counter. "Positions for a man named August Reed. Lives up in the Bitterroot Range, 8 miles out, give or take. He comes down once a month for supplies, sometimes less. Weather gets bad up there. It's not a gentle bad. It's a stay inside and pray bad." Nora did not shift her weight. She did not look down at her stomach or make any gesture that acknowledged it. "What does he pay?" "He'll negotiate that himself. I just put the notice up as a favor." Miller straightened and crossed his arms loosely. "He didn't ask me to put it up, truth be told. I asked him if he wanted company for the winter, and he said he didn't need company, he needed decent food, and I took that as permission." "When does he come down next?" "He came down this morning. He's at the livery right now, I expect, loading his horse." Miller paused. "Miss, I'm not going to pretend I don't see what I see, but Reed's a private man. He might have opinions." "Let him have them," Nora said. "I'd still like to meet him." Miller looked at her for another long moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and reached for his coat. "Come on, then," he said. "Before he decides he doesn't need food either." They found August Reed at the livery on the far end of Copper Falls's single main street, a street that was more ambition than town, 3 blocks of storefronts facing each other across mud that froze and thawed and froze again until it had the texture of something that had given up. The livery smelled of horses and clean hay and the iron cold that came in through the gaps in the siding. August Reed was loading saddlebags. He was a large man, though not in a way that announced itself. The size was in the width of his shoulders and the length of his arms, and the way he moved spoke of decades of hard physical work shaped from the inside out. Nothing wasted, nothing added. He was perhaps 44, though he looked older in some angles and younger in others, the way men look when they have lived outdoors for a long time and the sun and the cold have done their work. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples. His face was weathered to a color somewhere between oak and rust, with lines at the corners of his eyes and deeper lines at the corners of his mouth. He had the kind of jaw that people in old portraits always seem to have solid and deliberate, as if the face had been carved rather than grown. He did not look up when Miller and Nora entered. "Reed," Miller said. "Henry." August Reed settled a flour sack into the left saddlebag and checked the weight against the right side with a practiced hand. "Got someone here wants to talk about the position." Now he looked up. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of sky just before snow, and they moved from Miller to Nora in the way of a man who is actually looking rather than merely glancing, taking inventory rather than forming impressions. They stayed on her face first, then dropped briefly and unmistakably to her stomach, then came back to her face. He said nothing for a moment. Miller cleared his throat. "Name's Nora Hartwell. She's inquiring about the cook position." "I see that," August Reed said. He did not say anything else. He looked at Nora with those gray eyes that gave nothing away, and the silence between them had mass. It was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have each decided the other is worth observing. Nora looked back at him. She had been looked at for 8 months now by every variety of human judgment, pity and contempt, and the particular cruelty of people who expressed their disapproval through extended silence. She was not going to be the first one to fill this silence because she had learned that the person who fills the silence first is the person who is defending themselves, and she had nothing to defend. It was August Reed who looked away first. He turned back to his saddlebag and buckled the right side. "I need someone who can cook," he said to the saddlebag rather than to her. "Not fancy, just competent. Meat that's actually cooked through, bread that doesn't break teeth, coffee that doesn't taste like river water. I can do all of those things. Can you do them at 6,000 feet in December? I can do them anywhere there's a stove." He was quiet again. He moved around the horse with the unhurried efficiency of a man who was thinking while his hands worked. "I'm not a conversational man," he said finally. "Neither am I particularly." Something shifted in his face, not quite an expression, more like the beginning of one that got stopped. He checked the left saddlebag again, though he had already checked it. "Position pays $8 a month," he said. "Room and board included. You cook breakfast at 6, dinner at 7. What you do in between is your business as long as the meals happen. That's acceptable. There are things in that cabin that belong to me and are not to be touched." "Understood. I go out most days. Sometimes I'm gone 2 days, sometimes 3. When I'm gone, the cabin is yours." "All right." He turned to face her then fully and looked at her with an expression that was careful in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. "I have one condition," he said. She waited. "You don't ask me questions about my life. What I've done before, why I live up there, why I live alone. None of it." Nora kept her eyes on his. "I have the same condition," she said. "Exactly the same." Something moved briefly in his face. "When can you start?" "Now," she said. "If you can get me up that mountain before dark." Miller arranged a wagon to haul her single bag and the extra supplies he talked August into purchasing, enough flour and dried beans and salt pork to last through a hard stretch, along with the cinnamon and molasses that Miller suggested, with a sideways glance at Nora that August ignored. The ride up the mountain took 2 hours, through a landscape that was beautiful in the way that indifferent things are beautiful, not because they are trying, but because they simply are: the pines enormous and black against the white, the sky the color of pewter going toward lead, the silence so complete that the creak of the wagon wheels became the loudest sound in the world. Nora sat in the wagon bed, wrapped in a blanket that Miller had pressed on her, watching the mountain rise around them. August rode ahead on a gray horse that moved with the same economy its rider did. He did not look back at her once during those 2 hours. She found herself grateful for that. The cabin appeared through the trees at dusk, a low structure of hand-cut logs, with a stone chimney and a covered porch and a window on each side of the front door, the windows dark, the chimney cold, the porch railing holding a ridge of snow along its top rail like a white scarf. It was not a comfortable-looking place. It was a survivable-looking place, which was a different thing entirely, and in that moment Nora found it more beautiful than any building she had been inside in the past 8 months. August stopped his horse. He swung down and tied the reins to the porch post and turned to help her down from the wagon without being asked. His hands were large and very steady. He did not let go of her arm until she had both feet flat on the ground and her balance sorted. "Kitchen is on the left," he said. "Your room is at the back off the main room. There's a cot and a chest and a window that faces east." Then he went to unload the wagon, and she went inside. The inside of the cabin was the inside of a man who had been alone long enough to stop seeing his own disorder. The floor had been swept, but not recently. The table held the accumulated sediment of practical life tools that had been set down and not moved, a candle stub in a jar, a coil of rope, the skeleton of a rabbit trap someone had been meaning to repair. Books were stacked on a shelf in a way that suggested they had been consulted and returned to approximately the right area. Near the door hung a coat and a hat on pegs, and below them boots that were caked with old mud. The kitchen was a wood stove, a shelf of tins, a dry sink, a barrel of water with a skin of ice forming at the edges that she broke with her knuckle, and a cutting board that was warped from washing but still serviceable. She found a cast iron pan under the shelf and a Dutch oven and a battered tin coffee pot. She found the coffee coarse ground in a lidded tin that someone had labeled "coffee" in capital letters, as if they might otherwise forget. She found dried beef and a sack of dried beans and 3 onions. She had dinner started by the time August came in from the cold. He ate at the table without comment. She ate standing at the kitchen counter, which was a habit from the past several months of eating wherever and whenever she could. They did not speak. Outside, the wind had picked up and was working at the eaves of the cabin with a sound like something trying to find a way in. When she had cleaned the dishes and set the kitchen to rights, she stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and looked at August Reed, who was sitting by the stove with a piece of tack leather in his hands, working oil into it with his thumb. "I'll need to know where you keep the extra firewood," she said. "Shed's to the left of the cabin. Door sticks. Lift and pull." "Thank you." She went to her room. It was small, the way all rooms in a cabin like this were small, and the cot was narrow and the window faced east the way he'd said it did. She lay down in her coat and her boots because the room was cold and the blankets were thin, and she was too tired to deal with any of it properly. The baby moved a slow, rolling shift of weight that she had learned to sleep through over the past weeks mostly. Outside, the wind kept working at the eaves. She thought about Thomas. She did not let herself think about Thomas for long. She slept. She was not in the weeks that followed a woman who made herself agreeable. She was a woman who did her work. There is a difference between those two things that men who live alone often fail to appreciate until they encounter it. Nora Hartwell made breakfast at 6 without fail. She made dinner at 7 without fail. She kept the kitchen in order. She baked bread twice a week and kept it wrapped in cloth on the shelf. She washed the dishes and swept the floor on alternating days, and she had the fire banked before she went to bed each night so that August could stoke it easily when he woke before dawn. She did not sing while she worked. She did not make conversation. She did not ask him how his day had been when he came in from outside, and she did not tell him how hers had been, and she did not look at him in the waiting way of a person who wants to be noticed. She moved through the cabin like a woman who has found a temporary equilibrium and intends to keep it. He, for his part, moved through the cabin like a man who had forgotten that other people occupy space in the physical world and was in the process of remembering. He was not unkind. He was not impolite. He was simply a person whose social reflexes had gone dormant, gone soft, the way unused muscle goes soft, present still, but not immediately available, and now he was excavating them from somewhere deep and finding some of them still intact and others gone. On the 4th day he left a mug of coffee on the counter before she woke. It was exactly as strong as the coffee she had been making him, which was stronger than most people liked, because she had been making coffee this way since she was 12 years old, and her father had put a tin cup in her hands at the field hospital and said, "This is how soldiers take it. This is how you make it from now on." She drank it standing at the window, watching the sky turn from black to gray to white. On the 7th day he came in from outside with a cut on his left hand, a clean slice from a wood chisel that had slipped on a cold morning when his grip was not what it should have been. He was holding it wrapped in his own handkerchief, and the handkerchief was doing a mediocre job. Nora looked at his hand. She did not say anything. She went to the shelf below the dry sink and found a clean cloth and the small bottle of carbolic she had brought in her bag, the one her father had given her years ago, and that she had refilled twice and never gone without. She unwrapped the handkerchief and cleaned the cut and wrapped it properly. His hand was very large and very still while she worked. When she was done, he looked at his hand for a moment. "You bandage like someone who's done it before," he said. "My father was an army surgeon. I grew up watching him work." He said nothing more. But that evening at dinner, he sat at the table for a few minutes after he had finished eating, which he had not done before. He did not say anything during those minutes. He was just there at the table in the lamplight while she cleared the dishes. It was almost nothing. It was, she thought, something. On the 8th day it snowed hard enough to make the world outside the windows disappear entirely, and they were two people in a cabin at 6,000 feet with the nearest neighbor 8 miles down a mountain that no longer had a visible road. The snow hit the windows like thrown sand, and the wind under the eaves was a sustained low note that seemed to come from inside the walls rather than outside them. Nora could not sleep. This was not unusual. There were nights when the baby's position made lying down uncomfortable, and she would try one arrangement and then another, and then abandon the project entirely. There were nights when her mind, which she could discipline well enough in daylight, went to places in the dark that she did not have the energy to keep it from. She got up and went to the main room. August was already there. He was sitting in the chair nearest the stove with a hunting knife in his hands and a whetstone on the arm of the chair beside him, drawing the blade across the stone in long, slow, even strokes. He did not look up when she came in, but he also did not tense or shift, which told her that he had known she was awake and had perhaps been listening for her without quite admitting it to himself. She sat in the other chair. She had a book she was not going to read. She held it in her lap. The fire in the stove spoke in small voices. The wind pressed against the walls. The whetstone made its patient sound against the blade. 15 minutes passed in this way, maybe more. Then Nora said, not looking at him, looking at the stove, "Have you ever done something that you knew was wrong at the time? Not wrong in a vague way. Wrong in a way that you understood completely while you were doing it, but you did it anyway because doing the right thing would have cost you something you weren't willing to pay." The whetstone stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture to it, the silence of a room where someone is deciding something. "Yes," August Reed said. Nothing more than that. Nora nodded once as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "So have I," she said. The whetstone began again, slower than before, she thought. They sat like that until the fire burned down far enough that the room began to cool, and then Nora got up and went back to her room, and August put the knife away and added a log to the stove, and neither of them said good night because neither of them had said good night once since she arrived, and starting now would have been a change that neither of them was prepared to explain. In her room she lay in the dark and listened to the storm and thought about what she had said and what he had answered, and what those two small things meant pressed against each other in the cold and the quiet of this particular night. She thought they might mean something. She told herself that was not why she had said it. She was not entirely certain that was true. On the 9th morning she made a mistake that was not a mistake. She was reorganizing the kitchen shelf, which had been arranged by a man who valued proximity over logic, everything within arm's reach of where he stood, regardless of how often it was used. She was moving the baking tins to the upper shelf and the daily items to eye level, and in the process of clearing the lower section, she moved a stack of old newspapers and found beneath them a letter. She did not intend to look at it. She looked at it. The envelope was not sealed. It had been opened and read from the look of the crease in the paper many times. The return address on the upper left corner read in clear block letters, "Montana Territorial Prison, Deer Lodge, Montana Territory." It was addressed to Nora Hartwell, care of Copper Falls Post Office. It was her letter. She had mailed herself that letter 3 weeks ago from Bozeman, addressed to the Copper Falls Post Office to hold for her, and she had picked it up from Miller 2 days before she came up the mountain, and she had not yet opened it, and she had set it in her coat pocket with the intention of reading it when she was ready, and apparently at some point it had fallen out of her coat pocket while she was hanging the coat near the door, and apparently at some point August Reed had picked it up. She stood very still with the letter in her hands. She heard the door open behind her. She heard him come in the distinctive weight and pattern of his step. She heard him stop. She did not turn around. There was a long pause. "It was on the floor," he said. "By the door. I picked it up. I didn't read it." She looked at the envelope. Montana Territorial Prison, Deer Lodge. The letters were very clear. She put the letter in her apron pocket. She turned around. August Reed stood near the door with his coat still on and snow on his shoulders, watching her. His expression was the same one he always had, which was to say it was careful and closed and gave very little away. But there was something in the set of his jaw that was different. Something like the look of a man who has just understood something he did not have enough information to understand and is not going to pretend otherwise. He did not say what he clearly wanted to say. He did not ask. She stood across the room from him with her hand over her apron pocket, over the letter, over the return address that said everything it said. "I'm not a widow," she said. The words came out flat and clear, the way things come out when you have decided there is no good way to say them, and the only way is directly. August said nothing. "I told Miller I was a widow. I tell most people that." She kept her eyes on his. "It's easier. People will help a widow. They don't ask questions about a widow." He was still watching her with that expression that was not quite an expression. "My husband is alive," she said. "He's in the Deer Lodge prison. He's been there for 6 months." She stopped. She started again. "He was convicted by court-martial, theft of Army payroll. He was sentenced to 15 years. Outside, the wind had died down enough that you could hear individual snowflakes landing on the windowsill, which was the kind of quiet that only happened at the deepest part of winter, when the cold was so thorough it had silenced almost everything. "Did he do it?" August asked. It was such a plain question. She had expected something else. Any of the other questions people asked, the ones that were really just ways of deciding how much sympathy to allocate. "No," she said. "He didn't." She waited for the next question. There were several it could be. He asked none of them. Instead, he reached up and took off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door and turned toward the kitchen. "Is the coffee on?" he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and he moved past her toward the kitchen, and he poured himself a cup, and he sat down at the table, and after a moment she sat down across from him with her own cup, and they sat in the kind of silence that had changed its quality entirely from what it had been before, shifted from the silence of two strangers observing a contract to something else, something more like the silence of two people who have begun to understand that the things they are not saying occupy the same shape. She did not tell him more. He did not ask for more. But the letter stayed in her apron pocket for the rest of that day, and that night she put it in the chest in her room, and she lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the cabin settling in the cold, and she thought that she had told more of the truth to a man she had known 9 days than she had told to most people she had known for years. She was not sure what to do with that. She closed her eyes and waited for sleep. There is a quality that mornings acquire in the high Bitterroot country after a heavy snow. The world outside the cabin windows becomes something simplified, everything reduced to 2 elements, white and black, the snow and the trees. No gradation, no middle ground, as if the storm had come through in the night and edited the landscape down to its essential argument. She woke before 6 and started breakfast. This was the 11th day. She made oatmeal the field way, the way that prioritizes substance over sentiment, thick enough to hold a spoon upright, cooked long enough to be truly soft, no sugar because sugar was for comfort and oatmeal was for fuel. She had added salt and a small amount of the dried apple that Miller had included in the supply order, the apples reconstituting to something between the original thing and something older and more concentrated, and the smell of it, apple and oat, and the clean cold air from the window. She had cracked 2 inches to let out the cooking steam was the smell of a kitchen actually being used. August came in from outside at 6 on the mark. He had been up before her. She knew this because when she had risen to start the fire in the kitchen stove, The main room stove was already going and the wood box beside it was freshly filled. He went out every morning before first light, regardless of weather, and she did not know where he went, and she did not ask. He hung his coat and his hat and sat at the table. She put the oatmeal down in front of him and poured coffee for them both and put the pot back on the stove and then stood at the kitchen counter with her own bowl and ate standing, which was the way she had eaten for most of the last several months, eating standing in rented rooms and the corners of church halls and once in the back of a freight wagon while Montana rolled past at 3 miles an hour. He ate. She ate. The fire made its small sounds. After a while he said, "Your father, the surgeon." She waited. He served in the cavalry, the 3rd Cavalry. He went in as a captain of infantry and transferred to the medical corps in '62. She set her bowl down. He died in '69. Camp fever at Fort Laramie. It took half the garrison. August was looking at the table. "I knew men in the medical corps," he said. "3rd Cavalry." She looked at him. "That was a long time ago," he said. "Yes," she said. He did not say anything more. But she noticed that when he finished his oatmeal, he did not get up right away. He sat with his coffee and looked out the window at the white, simplified world, and she thought he was thinking about something specific, something the mention of the 3rd Cavalry had opened in him, the tumblers falling one by one into quiet alignment. She did not ask about it. She washed the dishes. That afternoon she found the medicine bag. She was cleaning the floor of her room on her knees with a cloth, cleaning the baseboards where dust had accumulated in the corners, and her hand went under the edge of the cot and encountered something solid. She pulled it out carefully. It was a leather bag, army issue, the kind that field surgeons and medical orderlies carried. It was well made, much better made than anything issued to common soldiers, the kind of bag that a man might have bought himself to replace what he'd been given because what he'd been given wasn't good enough. The leather was dark with age and use, and then more recently with the kind of careful preservation that comes from oil applied regularly by someone who intended to keep something for a long time. She unlatched it and opened it. Everything was there. Bandaging linen rolled tight, carbolic acid in a sealed tin, suturing thread in a small case, a lancet, 2 scalpels in leather sheaths, forceps, a bone saw that had been cleaned so many times the blade shone, splinting material, a glass bottle of laudanum still more than half full, every instrument clean, every supply organized, everything in its place, everything covered with a fine, even layer of dust. She closed the bag and latched it and pushed it back under the cot exactly as she had found it. She did not ask about it, but she sat with what she knew. The bag had been under that cot for a long time, long enough for dust to settle on instruments that had clearly been used that bore the evidence of use, and also the evidence of very deliberate cleaning after that use, as if someone had decided that the last time was the last time and had put everything in order before putting everything away. She thought about that. She thought about his hands when he had held hers steady while she bandaged his cut, not because he needed help holding still, but because she needed something to hold, and she had realized only afterward that he had understood this without being told. Surgeons' hands. She had known them since childhood, had felt their particular quality of stillness. You could not train hands like that. They were made by practice the same way a musician's hands were made by practice, built from the inside out by 10,000 repetitions of precise and consequential movement. She thought about the dust on the instruments. She did not ask. On the 13th day, Reverend Elmore Pike came down from Copper Falls. Nora did not know this until after, when August told her tersely that the Reverend had stopped by while she was out gathering snow to melt for washing water. He told her this because Pike had left something on the table, a letter in an envelope, and August set it on the shelf near the door where it would be seen without being in the way. He did not tell her what the letter said or who it was from. He did not tell her that Pike had been his pastor for 30 years, or that Pike had known him before the war and during it and after it, and had watched the particular transformation that the years after the war had made in him. He did not tell her that Pike had sat across from him in the store in Copper Falls and said with the directness that comes to men who know they have less time than other men that there were things between August and the world that had gone unresolved for too long. He told her none of this. But that evening after dinner he sat in his chair by the stove, and he did not pick up anything to work on. He sat with his hands on the arms of the chair, and he looked at the fire with the expression of a man who is reading something that only he can see. Nora sat across from him with her book. She watched him without appearing to. There was a story in his face. She had seen enough grief to recognize it, not the fresh kind, not the kind that cries, but the old kind that had dried out and hardened and become part of the structure of the face, present in every movement, every weather change, the way an old injury becomes part of the bone. He sat like that for a long time. Then he said, without looking away from the fire, "My wife died 16 years ago." Nora said nothing. She let the sentence be what it was. "She was sick," he said. "She asked for me at the end." He stopped. He started again. "I didn't go in." The fire shifted and a log settled, and the sound it made was the only thing in the room for a long moment. "I don't talk about it," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at her then. She kept her face quiet the way she had learned to keep her face quiet when there was nothing useful a face could add. "I don't talk about it," he said again, and this time it sounded less like a statement and more like a man reminding himself of a rule he had been keeping for a very long time and had just without intending to broken slightly. "You don't have to," she said. He looked away again, back to the fire. "I know," he said. They sat in silence after that for the better part of an hour. She read her book. He looked at the fire. The cabin creaked in the cold the way all wooden structures creak in extreme cold, a sound like the building adjusting to something it would rather not accommodate. Before she went to bed, she made sure the wood box was full for the morning. It was already full. He had done it while she was reading. The next morning a man came up the mountain. He arrived just after 8 when August was out checking his trap line and Nora was finishing the breakfast dishes. She heard the horse before she saw anything. A single horse moving slowly through the snow, and she went to the window and watched a man ride into the yard. He was perhaps 54, large-framed, running somewhat to heaviness now, but with the remnant structure of a man who had once been something in particular in terms of physical capability. He wore a heavy coat and a civilian hat, nothing identifying, but he carried himself with the posture that the Army printed into men, and that most of them carried for the rest of their lives, whether they wanted to or not. He tied his horse to the porch rail and knocked. Nora opened the door. "Mrs. Hartwell," the man said. The sound of her married name in a stranger's mouth was a small, precise shock. "I'm Sergeant Joseph Burke," he said. "Montana Territorial Prison, Deer Lodge. I have a letter for you from your husband, and some information I was asked to deliver in person." She stepped back from the door. He came in. He sat at the table and she sat across from him, and he laid the letter down between them without pressing her to take it, which told her something about him that he understood the weight of the thing he was carrying. "He's not well," Burke said. "I expect you know that from the letters." "He's been sick since August," she said. "His lungs." "The doctor at the prison gives him maybe 6 weeks." Burke paused. "He wants to see you. He asked me himself. He made me promise I'd find you." Nora looked at the letter. Thomas's handwriting on the front of the envelope. She knew it so well that she could have drawn it from memory in the dark the way he made his capital letters the slight leftward lean of all his lower case. "There's something else," Burke said. He said it carefully in the tone of someone who has been carrying a thing for a long distance and is now setting it down and wants to be certain it doesn't fall wrong. She looked up at him. "Colonel Warren Dodd," Burke said. "Do you know that name?" The name landed in her chest, the way a stone lands in still water, the initial impact, and then the rings spreading outward. She knew that name. Warren Dodd had come to their quarters on a Thursday evening in June. Thomas had been on patrol. Dodd had a stack of papers, and he had been apologetic about taking her time, and he had explained that the regiment's clerk was sick and the audit was coming, and he needed certain authorizations signed before the end of the week, routine paperwork that the lieutenant would have signed himself, but the deadline was tight. She had helped Thomas with paperwork before. Army wives did. She had signed where he indicated a dozen forms, and he had thanked her and taken the papers, and that had been the end of it. 2 weeks later, the payroll was missing. 3 weeks later, the money was found in their quarters in a trunk belonging to Thomas. 4 weeks later, Thomas was in chains. "I know that name," she said. "He stole the payroll," Burke said. "Your husband didn't do it. Thomas told the full story to the warden last month when he understood he wasn't going to recover. Dodd stole it to cover gambling debts. He planted the money in your quarters. The papers you signed were the receipts forged to match the missing funds." Nora sat very still. "Thomas knew this before the court-martial," Burke said. "He didn't say it then because Dodd told him that if he fought the charges you would be named as a co-conspirator. The receipts with your signature were enough to charge you, and you were with child." Burke stopped. He waited to see if she had anything to say. She did not. He continued, "Your husband chose to plead guilty rather than see you charged." The fire in the stove was burning steadily, and the light it made through the grate was the only light that moved in the room. "He knew he was innocent," she said. "He told me. He looked at me and told me he was innocent." "Yes," Burke said. "And I didn't believe him." This was not a question, and Burke was too careful a man to treat it as one. She put both her hands flat on the table. The letter was between them. She could see the slight leftward lean of the letters of her name. "Dodd is looking for you," Burke said. "He knows Thomas confessed. He knows the confession names him and gives enough detail that a proper investigation could open the case. He's been making inquiries along the supply routes Bozeman, Helena, Copper Falls. He's hired men to track you. Whoever told him you came up this mountain I don't know, but he has that information now." The door of the cabin opened. August Reed came in from outside carrying a brace of rabbits and snow on his shoulders, and he stopped when he saw the man at the table, and the air in the room changed the way air changes when a third element enters a compound that was already reacting. His eyes went from Burke to Nora and read her face in the way he had of reading things quickly and without apparent effort. "This is Sergeant Joseph Burke," Nora said, "from Deer Lodge Prison." August set the rabbits down on the kitchen counter and came into the main room. He did not sit. He stood near the kitchen doorway with his arms at his sides. Burke looked at him with the measuring look of a man accustomed to assessing other men quickly. "I was telling Mrs. Hartwell that there may be a threat to her safety," Burke said. "A man named Warren Dodd, Colonel Army, recently retired. He's been asking about her whereabouts." August said nothing. "Her husband has evidence," Burke continued, "in the prison. A record he kept during the investigation details that corroborate the confession and implicate Dodd specifically. If Mrs. Hartwell can get to Deer Lodge before Dodd finds her, before he has the chance to suppress the confession or discredit it, that evidence could clear her husband's name, and hers." "How far is Deer Lodge?" August said. "From here, taking the Ridgeback Pass route, about 90 miles. 4 days in good conditions." "And what's coming?" Burke glanced at the window. "Longer. Her husband has 6 weeks. The doctor said 6 weeks 2 weeks ago." The room was very quiet. Nora picked up Thomas's letter from the table and held it in both hands. She did not open it. She held it the way you hold something when you are not yet ready to know what it contains, but you need to feel the weight of it to understand that it exists, that someone who loves you put words on paper and folded it and sealed it and meant for it to reach you. "I have to go," she said. She said it flatly without inflection. A statement of observed fact rather than a decision. The way you say the snow is deep or the road is gone or the winter is coming. Not because you like it, because it is. She looked at August Reed. He was looking at her with the gray eyes that had been giving away slightly more than they used to, not much, but the margin was measurable now. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Burke. "I'll need to know the best route," he said, "and I'll need to know what Dodd's men look like if you have that." Nora looked at him. "You don't have to do this," she said. He moved past her toward the wood stove and opened the grate and added a log and closed it again. "No," he said. "I don't." He went to the kitchen and began to clean the rabbits for tomorrow's meal, and the sound of his work was the sound of a man who has made a decision and has nothing more to say about it. And Nora sat at the table with Thomas's letter in her hands and looked at the fire and thought about 6 weeks and 90 miles and whatever it was that lived in a man who would say "I don't" without it meaning anything other than exactly what it said. Outside, the wind had come back. It pressed at the walls of the cabin with the particular persistence of something that does not get tired, does not get discouraged, and intends to be there in the morning the same as it was the night before. Inside, 3 people made separate peace with what was coming, and the snow kept falling as it had been falling and would keep falling, indifferent and patient and thorough, covering the tracks of everything that had come before and leaving the road ahead as unmarked as it had ever been. The morning they were to leave August was up 2 hours before dawn. Nora heard him through the thin wall that separated her room from the main room, heard the careful sounds of a man trying not to wake someone while doing something that required sustained and deliberate attention, the sound of the stove grate opening, the sound of wood being placed, the sound of boots on the floorboards moving toward the kitchen and back, the sound of the leather bag being set on the table, latched open, each instrument checked. She lay still and listened and did not go out. There are moments when the most respectful thing you can do for another person is to let them have their privacy inside a space you share, to pretend the walls are thicker than they are. She had learned this in the army quarters of her childhood, where walls were always thin, and the sounds that came through them were the sounds of people managing things they had not asked to manage: grief and fear, and the ordinary human work of maintaining yourself in conditions that were not designed for your comfort. She listened to August Reed open a medicine bag for the first time in what she suspected was a very long time. She listened to him check each instrument carefully with the particular seriousness of someone who is reacquainting himself with something that once mattered very much. There was a long pause after what she thought was the bone saw, long enough that she found herself holding her breath without intending to, and then the sound resumed and the bag was closed and latched and the morning continued toward dawn. She got up and made breakfast. She made it the same way she had made it every morning for 2 weeks: oatmeal with dried apple and coffee strong enough to hold its own against the cold that came in under the door. She put 2 portions in bowls and poured 3 cups and set one of the extra cups near the kitchen door for Burke, who had spent the night in the shed with the horses rather than take the cot in the main room that August had offered without enthusiasm, and Burke had declined with the ease of a man accustomed to rougher accommodations. When August came to the table, he looked at the bowl in front of him and then at her. She had set the table the way she always did. His place at the head, her place to his left. Nothing different. He sat down. They ate. Burke came in from outside, smelling of horses and cold air, and ate standing at the kitchen counter, and the 3 of them occupied the cabin with the particular focused quiet of people who are about to do something difficult and have already said everything that needs to be said about it. After breakfast, August went out to load the horse and check the saddle rigging and examine the wagon that Burke had brought up from Copper Falls the previous day. Nora washed the dishes for the last time and put the kitchen in order and stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, looking at the narrow cot and the chest and the east-facing window. She had slept in that room for 14 nights. She had not expected to feel anything about leaving it. She put her bag over her shoulder and went outside. The sky was the color of old pewter, the clouds low and dense, the light flat and directionless in the way that precedes heavy snow. The cold was not the moderate cold of the previous week, but the serious cold, the kind that sits in your lungs when you breathe in and makes you understand that the atmosphere has opinions about you and they are not warm. August was checking the left side of the saddle rigging when she came out. He looked at her bag and then at the sky and then back at the rigging. "Storm's moving in from the northwest," he said. "We have maybe 6 hours before it arrives. Ridgeback Pass is 4 hours if we move well. We'll be through the worst of the grade before it comes. And if we're not, then we deal with it." He pulled the cinch and checked it again. "Get in the wagon. Keep the blankets around you. If anything starts to feel wrong, knock on the side. Don't wait until you're certain." She looked at him. "Don't wait until I'm certain about what?" He looked back at her with the gray eyes that had been giving away slightly more than they used to. "About anything," he said. She got in the wagon. Burke rode ahead. August rode behind. The wagon moved between them down the mountain road, which was more suggestion than road, Now a depression in the snow that corresponded approximately to where a road had been, the ruts filled in and the edges erased so that you had to know where it was to find it. Burke knew where it was. He had come up it 2 days before, and he had the kind of directional memory that develops in men who spend years moving through landscapes that don't forgive errors of navigation. The pines closed around them as they descended from the cabin's elevation. Enormous trees that made the road feel like a tunnel. The branches weighted with snow that fell in sudden soft avalanches when the wind moved through the upper canopy. The light came through gray and filtered the kind of light that makes distances hard to judge, that flattens the landscape and removes the shadows that tell you where the ground is and where it is not. Nora sat in the wagon bed with 3 blankets around her and Thomas's letter in her coat pocket, which was where it had been since the night before when she had finally read it. She had read it alone after Burke had gone to the shed and August had gone to his room, sitting in the chair by the stove with the letter in both hands. The handwriting was Thomas's and not Thomas's. The letters formed correctly, but without the pressure he normally applied to the pen, the way handwriting looks when the person writing it is conserving something. He had not blamed her. She had prepared herself for some measure of reproach, had thought it would be fair if there was some, had thought she could bear it, and perhaps needed to bear it. But there was none. He had written about the baby with a wonder that came through even in those careful, conserved letters, written about the fact of a child existing somewhere that he could not see or touch or speak to, and the wonder in it was larger than the circumstances that surrounded it, at least on the page, at least in the way he had written it. He had written about the evidence. The journal he had kept from the first days of the investigation, the details that only someone present at specific meetings and conversations could know, the dates and the amounts and the names of witnesses who had been kept away from the court-martial. He had written that the journal was in the 3rd cell in the east wing in the loose stone beneath the left wall, and that Burke knew the cell and could show her. He had written, "I should have told you from the beginning. I should have trusted you with the truth instead of trying to manage the danger myself. That was pride, not protection, and I have had 2 years to understand the difference." She had sat with the letter for a long time after she finished reading it. She had not cried. She had considered whether she wanted to and decided that she did not, or that she could not, which sometimes amounted to the same thing. She had folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and gone to bed and lay in the dark and thought about what Thomas had written and what it meant and what she was going to do with it. She knew what she was going to do with it. She had known before she read the letter. The wagon hit a rut under the snow and lurched sideways, and she caught herself against the sideboard with one hand and held the other against her stomach by instinct, and the baby moved in response, a slow, deliberate movement. Not distress, just the ordinary reassertion of a life that was proceeding on its own schedule, regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. "All right," she thought to the baby or to herself, which was increasingly the same thing. All right. They had been traveling for 2 hours when August pulled his horse alongside the wagon. She had been watching the tree line without purpose, the way you watch a landscape when you are in it, but your mind is elsewhere when his horse appeared at the left side of the wagon, and he rode level with her for a moment before speaking. "Burke's stopping ahead," he said. "He wants to look at something." "What?" "Tracks." He said it without inflection, without alarm, but carefully. "Probably an elk." She looked at him. "Probably," she said. He met her eyes briefly and then looked forward. It was not an elk. Burke had stopped at a junction where the road crossed a frozen creek, a place where the ground opened up enough that you could see 50 yards in several directions before the pines closed in again. He was off his horse and crouching at the edge of the road, looking at something in the snow, and when August rode up he pointed without speaking. Nora could see from the wagon. Horseshoe prints, 2 sets moving parallel, crossing the road at an angle and continuing south, recent enough that the edges of the prints were still crisp rather than rounded by subsequent snowfall. "2 riders," Burke said, "moving faster than we are. Could be headed for the southern approach to the pass." "How far ahead is the southern approach?" 8 miles. August was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the tracks with the expression of a man doing mathematics. "If they're looking to get ahead of us at the pass, they have enough of a lead to do it," he said. "Yes," Burke said. "Can we go around?" come at the pass from the east. Adds 4 hours, maybe 5, and the east approach is rougher. Rougher than being met at the south approach by 2 men we don't know are friendly. Burke stood up. He looked at August. The east approach has an old mining road for the first half. After that it's mostly following the creek bed. There's a place where the bank is steep, maybe 40 feet, one bad stretch. Ice could be a problem. August looked at Nora. She looked back at him. "I'll take the wagon," she said. "Whatever you decide." He looked at her for a moment longer than the question required. Then he turned his horse. "East approach," he said to Burke. "We move faster." The east approach was what Burke had promised it was, which was more honest than it was comforting. The mining road was a road in the sense that someone had once moved equipment along. It had cut the worst of the brush and leveled what could be leveled and accepted what could not. And over the intervening decades the mountain had been taking it back, with the patient thoroughness that mountains apply to everything men build. The ruts were deep where the summer mud had hardened and then been covered with snow, so that you felt the bottom of the rut when you did not expect it. The brush crowded the edges close enough that branches scraped the sides of the wagon with a sound like something trying to get in. Nora held the sideboard and watched the sky above the tree canopy, which was narrowing as they went deeper into the pass approach. The clouds had dropped since morning. The light was grayer. She knocked on the side of the wagon. August was beside her within 30 seconds. "It's not the baby," she said before he could ask. "I want to know something." He waited. "The bag under the cot," she said. "In my room." His face did not change, but something behind it did the small internal movement of a man who has been reached somewhere he did not expect to be reached. "What about it?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I found it when I was cleaning the first week. I put it back." "I didn't ask." She looked at him. "I'm asking now." The horse moved beneath him. In the trees to the left something shifted and released its load of snow with a soft collapse. "I was a medical orderly in the war," he said. "After the war I held a surgeon's position in the territories for 6 years, though I was not commissioned as one." He was quiet for a moment. "I tell people orderly or assistant because it stops the questions. The actual answer is longer than most people want to hear. And then I came up the mountain." He said it in the tone of a sentence that considers itself complete. "The bag's been under that cot a long time," she said. "Yes." "But you opened it last night." He looked at her. The gray eyes were doing the thing they did now, giving the margin away. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She let go of the sideboard. "All right," she said. He stayed level with the wagon for another moment, looking at her with an expression she was still learning to read, a language that had very few words but was not imprecise. Then he rode forward to rejoin Burke, and Nora sat back against the wagon side and watched the narrow strip of gray sky above the trees and thought about what it means when a person picks up something they put down a very long time ago and what it costs them, and whether the cost is the point or whether it is just the necessary condition of the thing being worth doing. She thought the cost was probably the point. She thought August Reed understood this better than most people. She thought for the first time in several months about something other than what she was afraid of. The Reverend Elmore Pike had not gone back to Copper Falls after his visit to the cabin. He had gone as far as the Miller store, where he had sat for an hour with a cup of coffee and Clara's hand on his arm and the letter from the Deer Lodge prison chaplain in his coat pocket, the one that had confirmed what the doctor in Copper Falls had told him, that his heart was doing what old hearts did when they had been working hard for 62 years without proper rest, that the remaining time was a matter of counting down and not up. He had sat with his coffee and his wife's hand, and he had thought about August Reed. He had known August Reed for 30 years. He had baptized him and buried his mother and married him and buried his wife and watched him walk up that mountain, watched from the valley, as the years accumulated, and the man on the mountain became less a person in the community and more a story. The community told the man who used to be a surgeon, the man whose wife died, the man who disappeared. He had kept August's secret for 16 years. He had kept it because August had asked him to, in the particular way that a man asks for something when he is at the outer edge of what he can endure, when the asking is not so much a request as a necessity, the last thing standing between him and something he cannot afford to face. Pike had heard confessions for 30 years. He knew the difference between a man who wanted absolution and a man who wanted the story sealed. The vault closed the evidence that he had been capable of that particular failure, kept away from the light. August had not wanted absolution. He had wanted the thing buried. Pike had buried it. But he had kept the letter. Ruth had given it to him in the last days when she understood that August was not coming, and also understood with the clarity that sometimes comes to people in those final days that there were things that needed to be said regardless of whether they would be heard immediately or ever. She had written the letter in the careful handwriting of a woman who was using her remaining strength with great deliberateness, and she had given it to Pike and asked him to hold it until August was ready. Pike had held it for 16 years. He sat in Miller's store with his coffee going cold and his wife's hand on his arm, and he thought about the woman he had heard about from Miller, the pregnant woman August had taken in on what amounted to a business arrangement, the woman who was the wife of a man in the Deer Lodge prison, the woman who was, according to Miller's account, not the kind of woman who leaned on anyone for anything. He thought about what it meant that August had hired her. He thought about what it meant that August had, by all reports, not asked her to leave when he found out who she was. He thought about the fact that he was going to die before the spring. He went up the mountain the next morning. August was not at the cabin when he arrived, and Nora Hartwell opened the door and looked at him with the kind of directness that he had learned to associate with people who were managing a great deal and had no reserves left for social camouflage. He introduced himself. She let him in. She offered him coffee, which he accepted because it was cold and because the walk from where he had tied his horse had been longer than he had calculated. They sat at the table, and she looked at him with those direct eyes, and he looked back at her, and they assessed each other with the mutual efficiency of two people who had both been through enough to make the preamble feel wasteful. "You're the Reverend he mentioned," she said. "Did he mention me?" "Once. He said the Reverend Pike had stopped by." "That's more than I expected," Pike said, which was honest. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "I came to see him, but I'm glad to meet you." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because I've been praying for someone to come up that mountain and give that man a reason to come back from wherever he went," Pike said. "And here you are." She looked at him steadily. "I came for work," she said. "I'm not anyone's reason for anything." "No," Pike agreed. "Of course not." He drank his coffee. "But things can be true without you intending them." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then looked at the table and said nothing, which he had learned over 62 years of listening to people was often its own kind of answer. He left the envelope on the table when August came back and found him there. He told August what he had told himself. He would tell him the simple version, just the facts of the matter, and the thing he had been holding, and why he had come today and not some other day. August had looked at the envelope. He had said he was not ready. Pike had said that was all right, that he was leaving it anyway, because the moment when a person decides they are ready is not a moment you can engineer from outside. It is a moment that arrives from inside, and all you can do from outside is make sure the door is not locked when it does. He had walked back down the mountain with the cold in his lungs that was both the weather and something else, and he had thought that whatever happened next on that mountain, at least the envelope was there. At least the door was not locked. The moment Burke held up his hand and stopped, everyone stopped. They were an hour past the worst of the Ridgeback East approach, past the steep section of creek bank that Burke had warned about, and that had been every bit as ice-covered as described, past the place where the wagon's left rear wheel had gone through the frozen creek surface up to the axle, and August and Burke had spent 20 minutes prying it out, while Nora held the horse past the narrowest section of the trail where the trees were so close on either side that the branches brushed both her shoulders at once. The sky had been lowering all afternoon, and now it was the color of a bruise, the kind of sky that does not so much threaten snow as simply announce it. Burke was at the tree line, his horse absolutely still, his hand in the air. August was beside Nora's wagon in 4 seconds. He said nothing. He was looking at what Burke was looking at. Ahead, where the mining road opened up into a broader clearing before the final approach to the pass, a man sat on horseback at the tree line on the far side. He was not moving. He was simply there the way something is there when it has been waiting and intends to continue waiting as long as necessary. Behind the man, barely visible in the tree shadow, a second shape. Another horse, another rider still. August put his hand on the rifle in his saddle scabbard, but did not draw it. "I know him," Burke said quietly from his position at the trees. He said it in the way you say something when what you mean is more complicated than the words. "Who is he?" August said. "Colonel Warren Dodd." The name moved through the air like the cold did, finding every exposed surface. Nora said nothing. She was looking at the man on the far side of the clearing with an expression that August could not entirely read, and he had been learning to read her expressions for 2 weeks. What he could see was that she was not afraid. Or rather that she was afraid, and the fear was somewhere below the surface, managed the way she managed everything from the inside out. Dodd put his horse forward, alone. The second rider stayed in the trees. He was a large man well into his 50s with a military bearing that the civilian coat did not disguise, and the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now merely commanding the handsomeness converted by time into something more like authority. He rode without apparent effort, the horse an extension of the body rather than a separate animal. He stopped 20 feet from the wagon. He looked at Nora. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. His voice was deep and measured, and not unkind, which was somehow worse than if it had been aggressive. "I'd prefer not to do this the hard way." Nora looked at him. "Then don't," she said. Dodd's eyes moved to August, then to Burke, then back to Nora, and there was something in the movement of his eyes that was not the calculation she expected, but something older and more complicated. "I have a territorial summons," he said, "signed by the governor's office. You're required to appear in Helena for an internal inquiry." "An inquiry you control," she said. "An inquiry into events surrounding the Hartwell case." "My name is also Hartwell," she said. "The case is also about me." Dodd was quiet for a moment. His horse shifted beneath him, and he steadied it with a slight pressure that was entirely unconscious. "I don't want to harm you," he said. "I want this to end cleanly." "Cleanly for you." "For everyone." Nora looked at him. In her coat pocket her hand was on Thomas's letter, not gripping it, just resting against it the way a person rests their hand against something they need to remember exists. "Your sons," she said. "How old are they?" The question landed strangely a word in the wrong language. Dodd's face changed. It was a small change, and he recovered quickly, but August saw it, the involuntary parting of the controlled surface. "The older one," Nora said. "The one who just made captain. He's what, 22? Dodd said nothing. "My husband was 30 when they took him," she said. "He had been a good soldier for 8 years. He was going to be a good father. He chose to let them take him because he was afraid of what would happen to me if he didn't. He chose it because he was trying to protect something." She paused. "If your son were sitting in that cell right now, because of something you did not, because of anything he did, and someone had the chance to stop it and chose not to, what would you want them to do?" The clearing was very quiet. The clouds had continued to drop, and the first fine particles of snow were beginning to fall. Dodd looked at her for a long time. He looked at August. August met his eyes and held them not aggressively, with the steady attention of a man who has been looking at hard things directly for a long time and has not yet looked away. "You were Army Medical Corps," Dodd said. "I was." "How long?" "The war, and after." Dodd looked away past the wagon, past the trees at the sky that was now definitively preparing to snow. He was working something out the way a man works out a calculation that has too many variables and none of them are clean. Then he said more quietly, "There's an investigation opening at Fort Benton. A financial matter. My older boy's name is in the paperwork." He paused. "Not because he did anything, because mine is in there first and names travel together." He looked at Nora directly. "I thought I had more time to manage it. I don't." He was not asking for sympathy. He was explaining the arithmetic. "The evidence your husband kept," he said. The journal. Yes, Nora said. If it's presented to a federal court. A real one, not an internal inquiry. He stopped. What happens to my son's career has nothing to do with what he did. He earned his rank. I know that, Nora said. Dodd looked at her again. He reached into his coat. August had the rifle out in a single movement. Burke's hand went to his sidearm. Dodd moved slowly, deliberately, one hand raised and open, while the other reached in and came out holding a folded sheaf of papers. Written statement, he said. Full account. Signed. He leaned forward and held it out. Burke moved his horse forward and took it. Burke unfolded it, read the first page, read the second, looked up at August. August looked at Nora. She was looking at Dodd with an expression that was not forgiveness. It was not satisfaction. It was something more complicated than either the expression of a person who has been waiting for a thing to happen and is watching it happen and finding it both exactly what they expected and also completely different from how they imagined it would feel. I'll go to Helena on Monday, Dodd said. U.S. District Court for Montana Territory. The full statement. I'll answer whatever they ask. He turned his horse. He stopped. Without turning back, he said, Your husband was a good officer. Before all of this. A pause. I'm sorry. He rode into the trees. The second rider followed. The clearing was empty and the snow was beginning in earnest now, and no one spoke for a long moment. Then Nora made a sound. It was not loud. It was not the kind of sound you make when you have won something. It was the kind of sound you make when something you have been holding at enormous cost finally drops, when the effort you have been sustaining for months releases all at once, and the release is not gentle. She pressed both hands against the side of the wagon and leaned forward and breathed. August was off his horse and at the wagon in a movement that was more reflex than decision. He did not say anything. He put one hand on the wagon board beside hers. Not on her hand. Not touching. Just there. She breathed. After a while she straightened up. We need to keep moving, she said. Her voice was steady. It had always been steady, but there was something in it now that had not been there before, something that was not strength exactly, more like what's left after you set strength down, the quiet that comes after. Yes, he said. He went back to his horse. They moved forward into the coming snow, the pass waiting for them up ahead and beyond it. Whatever truth had been kept in a loose stone beneath a prison wall, patient as the snow waiting to be brought into the light. August did not go to bed that night. Nora knew this because she lay awake listening the way she had learned to listen in this cabin, tracking the sounds that told her where he was and what he was doing the way a person tracks weather, not obsessively, just as a matter of practical awareness. She heard him in the main room, the stove, the chair, the particular quality of a man sitting still who is not sleeping. She did not go out. There are things a person needs to do alone, and she had learned enough about August Reed in 2 weeks to understand that whatever was happening in the main room on the other side of the thin wall was one of those things. She had learned that his silences were not all the same, that some were the silence of a man at rest, and some were the silence of a man at work, and some were the silence of a man who was doing something that required all of him, something that left no surplus for conversation or acknowledgement or the ordinary social negotiations of shared space. Tonight was the last kind. She lay on the narrow cot with her hands on her stomach and listened to the storm diminish outside, the wind dropping from its high sustained note to something lower and more intermittent. The snow still falling, but falling differently now, falling the way things fall, when the worst of the energy has spent itself, and what remains is the long, quiet aftermath. She thought about Thomas. She had been thinking about Thomas in a new way since reading his letter, a way that was different from the way she had thought about him for the past 6 months. For 6 months she had thought about him the way you think about a closed door, the finality of it, the impossibility of knowing what was on the other side. Now she thought about him the way you think about a door that is still closed, but that you know you are going to open. The not knowing was still there. The distance was still there. But the quality of it had changed. She thought about what he had written. I should have trusted you with the truth instead of trying to manage the danger myself." That was pride, not protection. She had read that sentence 4 times. She understood it. She also understood that she had done the same thing in the opposite direction, had managed the danger of her own feelings by converting a complicated truth into a simpler story, by making Thomas guilty because guilt was easier to carry than uncertainty. They had both managed. Neither of them had trusted. She thought about that for a long time. Outside, the storm settled into its final register, a low and patient sound. In the main room, August was very still. He had been still for a long time. She heard it when he finally moved, the specific sound of a man picking something up from a table. The small sound of paper, and then nothing for a very long time, and then the sound of paper again. She closed her eyes and did not listen any more after that. Some things deserved their privacy even through thin walls. What August did alone in that room with the letter was this. He sat in his chair with the envelope in his hands for perhaps 10 minutes before he opened it. He had carried the envelope from where Pike had left it on the table to the chair by the stove, had set it on the arm of the chair, had looked at it while he added wood to the fire, had picked it up again and held it. The way you hold something when the holding is itself a kind of preparation, when you are trying to accustom yourself to the weight of the thing before you commit to knowing what is inside it. Then he opened it. Ruth's handwriting was familiar, and not familiar the way all things are after 16 years, recognizable in its essential character, but changed in ways that time and circumstance create. She had written with care. He could see the care in the evenness of the letters, the deliberateness of each word, the way a person writes when they understand they have a limited amount of strength left and they intend to use it well. She had not written blame. He had expected blame, had been prepared for it, had been holding himself ready for it for 16 years, the way you hold yourself ready for a blow you know is coming, tensed against it, braced. There was no blame. There was something else instead, something he did not have an immediate name for, something that required him to read the letter twice before he understood what it was. She had written about fear. She had written that she had been afraid too in the last days, afraid of a great many things, afraid of pain and of the dark, and of the particular uncertainty that comes when you do not know what is on the other side of the door you are approaching. She had written that fear was not the worst thing, that the worst thing was when fear made you stop being honest with the people who needed your honesty. She had written that she understood why he had not come in, not because she agreed with it, not because it had not hurt her, but because she knew him well enough to know that he had been afraid too, and that his fear had made him small. In a moment that required him to be large, and that this was a human thing, a comprehensible thing, even if it was not a forgivable thing in the ordinary sense of forgiveness. But then she had written about forgiveness. She had written it in a way that was not sentimental and not easy, and not the kind of forgiveness that costs nothing. She had written it the way you write something when you have thought about it very carefully and arrived at it from a real place, rather than a dutiful one. She had written that she forgave him not because what he had done was acceptable, but because she did not want to leave the world carrying something that heavy, because the weight of it would have been the last thing she felt, and she had decided she did not want her last feeling to be that. She had written, "I hope wherever you are when you read this, you are somewhere with room in it. You were always too large for small spaces. I don't mean your body. I mean the rest of you." August sat with the letter in his hands for a long time after he finished reading it. The fire burned. The storm continued its diminishment outside. The cabin held its cold and its quiet around him. He thought about Ruth. He thought about the particular afternoon he had met her at a church social in the summer of 1862, when he had been young enough to be embarrassed by almost everything, and she had been entirely unembarrassed. Had moved through the afternoon with a direct ease that he had mistaken at first for arrogance, and had understood only later was just the ease of someone who had decided to be where she was, rather than wishing she were somewhere else. He thought about the years between that afternoon and the years after, the specific content of those years, not in a sentimental way, but in the way that you inventory things when you are trying to understand what they added up to, what the sum of the specific things is. He thought about the door. He had thought about the door so many times that the thinking had worn grooves in him, had become a reflex rather than a thought, something that happened automatically in the quiet spaces. He thought about it now differently than he usually did. He thought about it with the letter in his hands and the understanding new and uncomfortable that Ruth had known what was behind that door and had decided to go toward it anyway without him, had made her own crossing without him, and had found it in herself to write him a letter about forgiveness from the far side. He was not a man who wept easily or often. He sat in the chair and felt the weight of 16 years shift in him, not lift, not disappear, but shift, redistribute itself, settle differently across the structure of him. After a long time he set the letter on the table. He looked at the medicine bag. He had placed it on the table earlier, had opened it, and checked each instrument the way he had been doing since Nora arrived, since he had understood that something was going to be required of him on this journey that he had not allowed himself to be capable of for 16 years. He looked at the bag now with different eyes than he had looked at it before. Not the eyes of a man doing an obligation. The eyes of a man who was deciding something. He thought about Nora. He thought about the way she had asked him in the wagon about the bag under the cot. The directness of the question, the way she had said, "I'm asking now," the patience she had held in the waiting while he figured out what to answer. He thought about the way she had said all right when he had finished his inadequate answer, the way that all right had held neither judgment nor acceptance, but only the acknowledgment that he had said what he could, and she had heard it. He thought about what it meant that she was going to Deer Lodge to say something she should have said months ago to a man who might not have time to hear it. He thought about the door. He picked up the medicine bag and set it near the door where they would not forget it in the morning. Then he did the thing that was in its way the hardest thing he had done in 16 years, which was to go to bed, not to sit up through the night cataloging his failures, not to remain in the chair keeping himself awake with the work of remembering, to go to bed and to close his eyes and to permit the night to pass. He slept for 4 hours. It was enough. In the morning, Nora was already up when he came out. She had made breakfast, the same breakfast she had made every morning, oatmeal and coffee, and she had set his place the way she always set it, and she looked up when he came in and looked at him with the eyes that had been learning him, and saw something in his face that she did not comment on. He sat down. He ate. After a while she said, without looking up from her own bowl, "The bag is by the door." "Yes," he said. "Did you put it there last night?" "Yes." She looked up then. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him more frequently in the past week, with the directness that was not intrusive but was entirely without pretense. "All right," she said. They finished breakfast. Burke came in from the shed. They loaded the wagon. The mountain was cold and white and enormous around them, and the sky was the color of what was coming heavy with it pressing down. August swung up onto his gray horse. He looked back at the cabin once. He did not look back again. The pass came at them sideways. That was the only way to describe it later in the small hours of the following morning, when Nora lay awake, trying to organize what had happened into a sequence that made sense. The pass did not meet them the way a landmark meets a traveler, with the dignity of something waited for and finally arrived at. It came at them from the left, from a gap in the trees that Burke nearly missed entirely, and then the road tilted upward at an angle that the horse did not like, and the wagon liked less, and the world on either side of them dropped away into white. Nothing, into the kind of depth that snow obscures without filling, and they were on the spine of the ridgeback, with the wind coming from both directions at once, and the temperature falling at a rate that was not gradual. August rode close to the wagon. She could hear his horse breathing in the cold. She did not knock on the side of the wagon. The pressure had been building since mid-afternoon, since before Dodd, if she was honest with herself, which she had been trying to be for the past several months, with mixed results. It was not pain in the way she had been told to expect pain, which was the sharp, immediate kind that announced itself clearly. It was pressure, a weight that shifts and settles and shifts again, a tide rather than a wave, and she had been managing it the way she managed most things, from the inside out, telling herself it was not yet what it might be, telling herself there was still time, telling herself Deer Lodge was one more day if they moved well, and the weather gave them any margin at all. The weather did not intend to give them any margin. By the time they came off the north side of the pass, the snow was coming horizontally, and the temperature was the kind of temperature that stops being a number and starts being a physical argument. Burke's horse had slowed. August's horse was working hard, its breath coming in visible pulses that the wind caught and shredded. The wagon moved with the reluctance of something that had been asked to do too much for too long. Burke pulled up. August was beside the wagon before the motion fully registered. She had already decided before he reached her. She had decided on the pass in the worst of the wind, when the baby had shifted in a way that was not the ordinary, shifting a drop, settling the particular movement that her body recognized before her mind did the body's knowledge arriving before the mind's translation of it. She opened the wagon canvas. "How far to the mine Burke mentioned?" she said. August looked at her face. He said nothing for half a second, which was all the time he needed. "Burke," he said without raising his voice, in the tone of a man accustomed to being heard clearly at a distance in conditions that were not quiet. Burke turned his horse. "The mine. How far?" 2 miles. Maybe less." "Move." The mine was exactly what Burke had described, and not what anyone would have chosen. It was an old silver operation abandoned when the vein played out. Sometime in the previous decade, the main shaft driven horizontally into the base of a granite outcropping, 12 feet wide and 20 feet deep. The floor-packed earth, the ceiling rough stone that sloped down toward the back, the mouth partially collapsed on the left side, so that entry required a deliberate sideways step that Nora managed with the help of August's hand, and concentrated attention on the placement of her feet. Inside, the wind stopped. That was the first thing. The silence of wind absence, which is not the same as quiet but is so much better than what they had been in for the past 3 hours that it functioned as relief. Burke had a fire going in 8 minutes. He had been doing this long enough in enough conditions that the process was automatic tinder from the dry inside pocket of his saddlebag wood from the dead fall at the mine entrance, the fire built against the right wall where the stone would hold heat and the smoke would find its way out through the collapse on the left side. August brought the blankets from the wagon. He spread them on the packed earth floor in the warmest section in the angle between the right wall and the fire, and he helped Nora down, and she sat with her back against the stone and her knees up and her hands flat on the floor on either side of her. And she breathed in the deliberate way she had been practicing since afternoon, the way her father had once described to her in clinical terms that she had not understood then and understood entirely now. August knelt in front of her. "Tell me what you're feeling," he said. "Pressure. Regular intervals. Maybe 8 minutes apart." "How long?" "Since before the pass." She looked at him directly. "I didn't say anything because we needed to get through the pass." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his face that was not quite an expression, was the shadow of one. "All right," he said. He stood up and went to the mine entrance and retrieved the medicine bag from the wagon. She watched him open it. She had wondered since the morning when she heard him check it in the dark what he would look like doing this, whether it would be the movements of someone returning to a familiar place or the movements of someone entering a room they had locked years ago and were opening for the first time. It was both. His hands moved with the certainty of deep practice, the certainty that lives in the muscles rather than the mind pulling the bandaging linen and setting it to his right, the carbolic and the clean cloth, the suturing thread in its small case. But his face had an expression she had not seen on it before, an expression that was not quite present, that was partially in this room and partially in another room in another time, and she understood that whatever room he was partially in was not a good room, and she understood that he was staying here anyway, that he was making a choice about where to be with every movement of his hands. Burke fed the fire and then moved toward the mine entrance. "I'll see to the horses," he said. He said it in the tone of a man who understands that his most useful contribution at this moment is his absence. August nodded without looking up. They were alone in the mine with the fire and the stone and the sound of the storm working at the world outside and unable to get in. For the next 2 hours, August Reed was entirely present. Not present in the way of a man trying to be present, not performed attentiveness from someone managing their own discomfort to appear capable. Present the way surgeons are present, which is the most complete kind of presence there is because it strips everything else out of the room. He tracked the intervals between contractions with a method so practiced it seemed like a natural sense checked what needed checking and told her what he found in the plain terms of someone for whom this information was clinical rather than alarming, guided her breathing with a sequence of words that were not comforting words but were useful words which were better. At some point she asked him in the middle of something, because the middle of something is when you ask the questions you have been not asking. "Were you there?" she said. "When your wife—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. He was quiet for a moment. His hands continued their work. "No," he said. She breathed through a contraction. When it passed, she said, "Where were you?" "Outside the door," he said. "I chose to be outside the door." She looked at him. He was looking at his hands. "She asked for you," Nora said. It was not a question. "Yes." "And you didn't go in?" "No." She breathed. She thought about what it costs a person to say that. To say it plainly, without defense, without the architecture of justification that people build around their worst choices. She thought it probably cost more than most things she could name. "Why?" she said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because someone told me the child wasn't mine," he said, "and I chose to believe them. Because it was easier to believe them than to go in and look her in the face and know what I thought of her." He paused. "It was not easier. I thought it would be easier. It was not." She breathed through another contraction, longer this time, and when it passed she was damp with effort, and the fire was throwing amber light across the stone walls, and August Reed was still there, still kneeling, still looking at his hands. "Was it true," she said, "what they told you?" "No," he said. "I found out later. The man who told me had wanted her himself. He told the story because she had chosen me instead." He stopped. She knew I believed it. She knew at the end, and she still asked for me. Nora said nothing. There is a category of human failure that is not the dramatic kind, not the kind that involves grand decisions in visible moments, but the quiet kind, the failure of nerve in an ordinary corridor, the failure of faith in an ordinary room, the ordinary catastrophic choice to remain outside a door you could open. She had made her own version of this failure. She knew its weight and its texture and the particular way it embedded itself in everything that came after. She did not say any of this. She put her hand on his arm, not with pressure, just resting there. He looked at her hand. He looked at her. And then the contraction came that was different from the others. Not tide, but wave. And everything that followed happened in the present tense, in the only tense that mattered, in the tense that August Reed had been absent from for 16 years and was now without option and without pretense fully inside. He worked. He worked the way he had worked in the field hospitals of the war, in the surgical tents, in the Dakota Territories, in every situation where the situation was the only thing there was, and the past and the future, and the weight of personal history were luxuries that nothing about the present allowed. His hands did what his hands knew. His voice was steady. His eyes were on what they needed to be on. Nora worked too. She had not been told what this would be. She had been told things, had been given information by the post-surgeon's wife in Fort Benton and by the older woman at the church in Helena and by her own body's reading of itself over the preceding weeks. But information is not experience, and what she was doing now was experience was the most primary version of the physical, and she moved through it the way you move through something that is larger than you by finding the next step and taking it and not looking at the full distance. She was not quiet. She was not ashamed of not being quiet. The mind held the sound the way stone holds everything impartially without judgment. And then the baby came. It came in a rush that was both completely expected and entirely shocking, the way things are when you have been preparing for them for months, and they happen anyway with the full force of their actuality, and August Reed's hands were there, and the baby was in them, and the world held its breath. The baby did not cry. It was so quiet. August's face, which she could see because she was watching his face, changed. It did not become the face of a man who had lost control of a situation. It became the face of a man who was somewhere else. Briefly, the briefest fraction of a moment in another room outside which he had stood, while something inside required him, and he had not gone in. And then he came back. He was back before the moment fully formed. He turned the baby face down, one large hand supporting the chest with a care that was almost unbearable to watch, and with his other hand he cleared, and then he struck between the shoulder blades, once controlled the precise force of someone who knows the difference between enough and too much. The baby did not respond. He struck again. He struck a third time, and this time the force was not greater, but the intention behind it was the whole of him. Behind it, 16 years of standing outside doors, and the letter on the table, and the medicine bag under the cot, and the woman in front of him who had trusted him with the most essential thing. And the baby coughed. It coughed. And then it cried. The sound it made was the sound of something that had decided to be here, that had made the choice available to it, and made it in the direction of the world, rather than away from it, a small, furious declaration of presence that filled the mind the way the wind filled the pass completely without apology. August sat down. He sat down heavily with the baby held against his chest, with his back against the wall of the mine, and he sat with the firelight on his face. And Nora watched his face do something it had not done in front of her before, something that required the removal of every layer of control, every practiced containment, every wall that a man builds between himself and the things that are too large to keep inside. He wept, not loudly, not with collapse. The way men weep when they have held something for too long and the holding finally becomes impossible. Tears tracking down a weathered face with the same patience that water finds its way through stone, not violently, just persistently, just following the only direction available to it. He held the baby, and he wept, and Nora watched him, and she did not look away. She reached out and touched his arm again, the same place, the same weight. He looked at her. She held out her hands. He placed the baby in them with the care of someone who has understood something about carefulness that they had previously only known in theory. The baby was a girl. She was red and furious and loud, and her eyes were the unfocused blue of all newborns, seeing everything and nothing simultaneously oriented toward warmth and sound and the particular frequency of her mother's voice, which she had been hearing for 8 months, and recognized with the total confidence of something that has known one true thing its entire existence. "Hello," Nora said. The baby looked at the middle distance and continued to make her opinion known. "Her name," Nora said, quieter now, looking at the baby's face in the firelight. "I've been thinking about her name." August said nothing. He was getting himself back together with the deliberateness of a man rebuilding something from scattered components piece by piece, no shortcuts. "Clara," she said, "after the Reverend's wife. She was kind to me when she had no particular reason to be. I'd like the baby to have her name." She paused. "And for the middle name, if you'd allow it." He looked at her. "Ruth," she said. The fire cracked. Snow moved against the mountain outside with the sound of something vast and patient. August looked at the baby in Nora's arms. The baby. Clara Ruth had begun to settle her cries, reducing to the occasional protest, her small fist near her mouth, her weight finding the arrangement of arms and warmth that satisfied some ancient requirement. He looked for a long time. "All right," he said. It was said simply, but nothing about it was simple. Bert came back 20 minutes later, shaking snow from his coat, and stopped in the entrance of the mine and looked at the scene by the fire and did the polite thing, which was to express no particular surprise, and to ask what needed doing in a tone that suggested he was ready to do it. There was plenty that needed doing. He did it. And outside, the storm moved across the Bitterroot country with the thoroughness that storms bring to that landscape, covering everything with equal impartiality, the road and the trees and the pass they had come through and the tracks they had made coming through it, until there was no evidence of the path they had taken, until the mountain looked as it had before they crossed it, as if no one had come this way at all. They reached Deer Lodge on the 4th day after the mine. The pace had been slow by necessity, Nora unable to ride and the wagon taking the frozen roads at a walk, stopping twice more at way stations where August negotiated shelter with money, and once with the labor of fixing a broken axle on a farmer's equipment in exchange for a warm room and a meal. The storm had passed in the night following the mine spending itself against the mountains and moving east with the aimless energy of weather that has accomplished its purpose, and the mornings that followed were the kind of mornings that appear after violence. Startling in their clarity, the sky a hard, clean blue, and the snow so bright it required squinting, the air cold, but still as if the world were apologizing. Nora held Clara Ruth inside her coat for warmth during the final miles. She had not slept much in the mine or in the trapper's cabin where they had stopped the first night, a structure so small that Burke had slept with the horses, and August had sat in the single chair by the stove all night, while Nora and the baby occupied the cot. She had not slept much, but she had rested, which is different, which is the kind of rest that is available to a body that has done something enormous and needs to begin the process of understanding what it has done. She had fed the baby. She had watched August check his instruments and repack the bag with the same deliberateness with which he had unpacked it, the bag returning to the table rather than to under the cot, sitting there in plain view in the place of a thing that was used rather than hidden. She had watched Burke make coffee in the dark before dawn and hand the first cup to her without being asked. Montana Territorial Prison sat at the edge of Deer Lodge like a period at the end of a very long sentence, a structure of gray stone that had been built to look permanent, because permanence was the point, because the message it needed to send was not to the people inside it, but to everyone who looked at it from outside, the message that there were consequences, that the consequences were solid and cold, and would still be standing when everyone who remembered the original occasion was gone. Burke spoke to the warden's office while August stayed with the horses, and Nora stood in the yard with Clara Ruth against her chest and looked at the building. She had been imagining this building for 6 months. The imagining had been useful in the way that preparing for something difficult is useful. It had given her a container for the fear, a specific shape to attach it to, rather than letting it remain diffuse and therefore everywhere. But the building itself was also simply a building stone and mortar and iron, and the fear she had been carrying was too large for it, exceeded it. On every side had always been about something larger than the place, had always been about the man inside it, and the space between them and the words that had not been said. Burke came back. He nodded. She followed him inside. August stayed in the yard. She did not ask him to come. He did not offer. There are things that belong only to certain people, and this was one of them. This particular hallway with its particular smell of stone and lamp oil and the absence of weather. This particular walk past doors that did not open, this particular moment of being brought to a stop in front of a door that did. The guard unlocked it. She went in. The room was small and cold, the cold of stone that has been cold for a long time and does not warm easily. There was a cot and a small table and a lamp, and on the cot under 2 blankets, Thomas Hartwell. She had been preparing to see him diminished. He was diminished. But he was also unmistakably and entirely Thomas. The same eyes, the same particular quality of attention in those eyes, the way he had always looked at her as if she were the most interesting thing in the room, not the most beautiful or the most impressive, but the most interesting. The way a person looks when they are genuinely curious about what the other person is thinking and not merely performing curiosity. He looked at her and his face did the thing it had always done when he was trying not to show something too large. She went to him. She sat on the edge of the cot, and she put Clara Ruth into his arms, not asking first, just placing her there, because there was no time for the preliminary, no time for the slow approach. And Thomas's arms came up around the baby with the instinct of someone who has never held an infant, but whose body knows exactly what to do. The ancient knowledge, the knowledge that precedes instruction. He looked at his daughter. Clara Ruth looked at the middle distance. He looked at Nora. She was going to say something prepared. She had been preparing something for months, had been building a sentence or a series of sentences that would carry the weight of what needed to be said without crushing everything under it. She had been constructing it and revising it, and she had a version she considered close to right. She said none of it. She took his hand. She said, "I know. I believe you. I have believed you since before I had proof, and I'm sorry it took me that long, and I'm here." He looked at her for a long time. He said, "Clara." "Clara Ruth." She watched his face. "Do you like it?" "Yes," he said. His voice was not what it had been. It was the voice that breath problems make careful and somewhat thin-rationed. "Yes, I like it very much." They sat like that for a long time. Outside the small window, the blue sky of the post-storm morning was doing what it does, being absolutely clear and offering no warmth whatsoever. Beautiful in the way that certain honest things are beautiful, not because they comfort, but because they do not lie. Thomas asked about the journey. She told him parts of it, the parts that had shape. She did not tell him about the mine, not yet, not in this room. That was a story for another time and another place. A story she wanted to tell him properly when he could hear all of it. She told him about Dodd. He was quiet for a long time after that. "He came himself," Thomas said. "Yes." "And gave a written statement." "Yes." He looked at Clara Ruth, who had begun the process of sleeping with the total commitment of the newly born, her face arranged in the expression of someone who has examined the available options and found sleep to be the most reasonable one. "I used to think," Thomas said slowly, the rationed voice, "that people were either the kind who did the right thing or the kind who didn't, that the line was fixed." He paused for breath. "I've had a while to think about it differently." "What did you decide?" "That the line moves," he said. "That most people are on one side of it most of the time and the other side of it sometimes. And the difference between a person who does good and a person who doesn't might just be how long they wait before crossing back." She looked at him. "That's generous," she said, "given everything." "I've had time to get generous," he said, and she heard something in it that was quieter than bitterness, something that 2 years in a stone room had worn down to its actual shape, something she could only call grace, the worn kind, the kind that costs. They sat until the light from the small window changed angle, until Clara Ruth woke and made her requirement known, until Thomas's breathing had the quality of someone approaching the boundary of what they could manage and needing to rest. Before she left, she leaned down and put her forehead against his. She stayed like that for a moment. He put his hand on her face. She straightened up. She picked up Clara Ruth. She went to the door. "Nora," he said. She turned. "The man who brought you here," he said. "Burke told me about him." She waited. "He stayed," Thomas said. "Yes," she said. Thomas looked at his daughter. "Good," he said. She went out. August was still in the yard. He was standing near the gate with his horse not leaning against anything, not doing anything in particular, just standing in the winter sunlight that gave light without heat. His coat open because he ran warm, his face turned slightly away from the entrance as if giving her the privacy of the approach. She stopped a few feet from him. Clara Ruth was awake and looking at the blue sky with the expression of someone encountering something for the first time and finding it complicated. August looked at the baby, then at Nora. He looked at her face the way he had been looking at her face for weeks, with the attention of someone learning a language that has no dictionary, building the vocabulary from context and repetition and the accumulation of small, observed moments. He did not ask how it went. He could see how it went, or enough of it. "Burke has the journal," she said. "He knows where the federal court is." "We'll go tomorrow," he said, "when you've rested." She looked at him. The sunlight was doing the thing it does in December in Montana, lying flat across everything, illuminating without warming, making the world very clear. "He said you stayed," she said. August said nothing. "He said Burke told him about you, and he said you stayed." She shifted Clara Ruth against her chest. "He seemed pleased about that." "Did he?" "Yes." August looked at the baby again. Clara Ruth had finished her assessment of the sky and was now conducting an assessment of August, which she prosecuted with the focused intensity of someone who has very recently acquired the ability to look at things and intends to use it. He extended one finger toward her. Her hand, which was the size of a walnut, closed around it with the automatic grip of the newly born, the grip that does not know yet what it is holding, but holds on anyway, the grip that precedes understanding. He stood like that. Nora watched him stand like that. The U.S. District Court for Montana Territory received the full package on Thursday morning, 3 days after they arrived in Deer Lodge. Burke delivered it in person, the written statement from Colonel Warren Dodd, the journal from the cell wall, and his own sworn testimony regarding what Thomas Hartwell had confessed and the circumstances of that confession. The clerk at the receiving desk was a thin man with a precise manner who read the first 2 pages of Dodd's statement and then read them again, and then looked up at Burke with an expression that suggested he had been doing this work for a long time, and this was not the kind of morning he had expected to have. The judge assigned to the case was a man named Carver, a territorial appointee in his 60s, who had seen most of what Montana had to offer in the way of legal complication and had developed opinions about it. He reviewed the materials that same afternoon and issued a preliminary order opening a formal inquiry, which meant that Dodd's statement was now on record, which meant that the original court-martial verdict was formally under review, which meant that the weight of the law had shifted slowly, the way large things shift but shifted. It would take months for the formal exoneration to be completed. Thomas Hartwell did not have months. He died on a Tuesday morning, 12 days after Nora arrived in the early hours before the day shift came on, when the prison was as quiet as it ever got, and the sky outside his small window was the deep dark blue that precedes dawn. The chaplain was with him. He had asked for the chaplain the night before, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted someone to talk to in the final hours, and the chaplain, who was a practical man with theological opinions that had been refined by years of sitting with people at the end of things, had stayed. Burke was there as well. Thomas had asked for him too. He had not asked for Nora because he knew she was sleeping, finally properly sleeping, and he had said to Burke the night before, "Let her sleep. She needs it more than she needs to be here for this particular part." She was here for the part that mattered. He was right about that. She had been there for the part that mattered. She learned of his death from Burke at first light, who told her in the plain and careful way of a man who has delivered this kind of news before and understands that the only way to deliver it is directly and without adornment. She sat with it. August was in the doorway of the room where they had been staying, a room above the general store in Deer Lodge that the proprietor had offered with the hospitality that small towns extend to people in visible difficulty. He did not come into the room. He stood in the doorway, and he looked at her, and he stayed. She held Clara Ruth, and she sat with what she felt, which was not one thing but many things, grief and relief and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running toward something for a long time and has arrived to find that the destination and the goal were not quite the same thing. She had arrived. She had said what needed to be said. Thomas had heard it had held, his daughter had died knowing what he needed to know. She had not been there at the end. She thought about August standing outside a door. She thought that Thomas had been right to let her sleep, that this was not the same thing, that there is a difference between choosing absence and being given it by someone who loves you, that Thomas's last gift to her was exactly that, the gift of not having to watch, of being allowed to be where she was resting, already past the worst, already on the other side of the thing. She thought about this for a while. Then she looked up at August in the doorway. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat in the chair across from her. Clara Ruth was awake and conducting her ongoing research into the nature of the world from the position of her mother's arms. August looked at the baby, and the baby looked at August, and whatever was communicated in that exchange was communicated without language, the way the most fundamental things always are. "What do you need?" he said. She thought about it. "I need to take Thomas home," she said. "He should be buried properly, not in the prison yard." "We can arrange that." "And I need to send a letter to his family. Even if they don't respond, they should know." "Yes. And I need—" She stopped. She looked at Clara Ruth. She looked at August. "I don't know what comes after that." He was quiet. "That's all right," he said. "You don't have to know yet." She looked at him. "You said that like a man who knows it from experience," she said. He looked at his hands. The hands that had done what they did in the mine, that had done what they had refused to do for 16 years, and then done it, that carried the weight of both. "I spent a long time not knowing what came after," he said. "I'm still not entirely certain." "What did you do during the not knowing?" "Survived," he said. "Badly, mostly. Then less badly." He paused. "Then someone showed up on the mountain and needed things, and it turned out that needing things and being needed are not as different as I thought." She looked at him for a long time. "August," she said. "Yes. I don't want to go back to the mountain because I have nowhere else to go." He met her eyes. He did not look away. "I know that," he said. "I want to go back because—" She stopped. She started again. "Because Clara needs to grow up somewhere that has room for her, and because I'm tired of moving, and because the cabin is cold but it's honest, which is more than I can say for most places I've been." She shifted the baby. "And because I think you might need someone to stop you from being alone in the way that isn't peace, the way that's just unfinished business with yourself, dressed up as peace." He was very still. "That's a lot to say to a man who doesn't talk much," he said. "I know." She held his gaze. "Do you want me to say it again?" Something shifted in his face that contained expression, releasing something, not all of it, maybe not ever all of it, but enough. Enough to be visible. "No," he said. "I heard it. And—" He looked at Clara Ruth. He looked at Nora. He looked at his hands. "And I think," he said, "that a man who has been alone for 16 years and is only just now learning that the alone was not what he thought it was, might not have a great deal to offer." "I'm not asking for a great deal," she said. "I'm asking for someone to stay." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window of the room above the general store in Deer Lodge, Montana Territory. December 1882. The world was white and still and enormous. In the way that only the Western territories are enormous. The scale of things so much larger than human scale that the human choices made inside it seem both very small and very consequential. Both completely individual and part of something that will outlast everyone who makes them. "I can do that," August Reed said. It was not a declaration. It was what it was. The plain statement of a plain intention said by a man who had learned through the worst possible instruction that plain intentions plainly stated are the only kind that matter, that the elaborate ones collapse under their own architecture, that the simple ones, if they are genuine, have the durability of stone. He could stay. He would stay. Thomas Hartwell was buried in the Copper Falls churchyard on a Friday in late December, in ground that Reverend Elmore Pike had consecrated, and that Pike's wife Clara had tended for 30 years under a headstone that was plain and honest and said what it said without embellishment. Lieutenant Thomas Hartwell, 3rd Cavalry, husband and father, innocent. That last word had required the completion of the legal process, which moved faster than such processes typically moved, because Colonel Warren Dodd had been as good as his word had appeared before the federal court, as he had said he would, and answered what was asked and not prevaricated about the answers. It took 3 sessions, 3 mornings in a courtroom in Helena, where Dodd sat in a chair and told the truth about things he had not told the truth about for 2 years. And the telling of it had a quality that the court recorder noted in his transcript, but the official record did not preserve the quality of a man who has decided that the remaining portion of his life will not be spent running that. Running is its own kind of imprisonment, and he has served enough of it. At the burial, Clara Pike stood at the edge of the small gathering, wrapped in a dark coat, her hands folded in front of her. She was smaller than August remembered, or perhaps grief had redistributed her somehow. He went to her after, when the others had moved away toward the church and the warmth. "He found what he was looking for," she said before he could speak. "Elmore. He said so the last week. He said the envelope was off his hands and that was enough. August looked at the headstone. He held it a long time, he said. He did. She put one gloved hand briefly on August's arm. He was good at holding things until the right moment. It was his particular talent. She looked at him steadily. He thought you were worth waiting for. She walked back toward the church. August stood at the grave for another minute in the cold and the flat December light and thought that Elmore Pike had understood something about patience that most people spent their whole lives trying to learn. The formal exoneration was issued in February. By then Nora and Clara Ruth were back on the mountain. By then certain things had changed in the cabin at the Bitterroot's high elevation that would have surprised anyone who had known it in its previous configuration. The kitchen shelf had been reorganized with a logic that made sense to someone other than August, which took some adjustment on his part and which he managed with only occasional and minor friction. The east-facing window in the back room had a curtain now made from cloth that Clara's weight on the list of supplies had resulted in being included in Miller's order without explicit discussion. The wood box was filled each morning, but it was not always filled by the same person, which was a change from the previous arrangement, and both parties found the new arrangement workable. Clara Ruth had opinions about most things. She had her father's eyes, which Nora noticed one morning in March when the light was coming through the east window at an angle that illuminated the baby's face with the particular clarity of late winter light. The light that has been fighting through cloud and distance all winter and finally arrives. The eyes were not blue anymore, the temporary blue of the newborn that gives way to the permanent color in the first weeks, and the permanent color was a particular dark gray that was quieter than August's gray, quieter than the gray of sky before snow. The gray of still water. She had Thomas's eyes. Nora sat with that for a morning. She sat with it and let it be what it was, which was both loss and presence. Simultaneously grief that had been given enough time to become part of the structure rather than an emergency. August found her sitting at the kitchen table with the baby in her lap, and the expression on her face that he had learned over months to read. The expression that was not sadness exactly, but was adjacent to it, the expression of someone doing the particular interior work that cannot be hurried. He put coffee in front of her. He sat across from her. He did not say anything. After a while she said, "She has his eyes." He looked at the baby. He looked at Nora. "Yes," he said. "I think that's right," she said. "I think that's how it should be." He nodded. "She'll have questions someday," Nora said. "Yes." "About him, about everything." "Yes." She looked at August across the table. The morning light was coming through the window on a flat winter angle, and it lit the planes of his face and the gray at his temples and the lines that the years had made, and that were not only the years but the specific content of the years, the weight of particular choices carried for particular lengths of time. "Will you still be here?" she said. "When she has those questions?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Just that." One word said in the tone of a man who has learned that one word said with full intention is worth more than a page of qualifications said in the tone of someone who has stood outside enough doors to understand the value of going in. Clara Ruth put her fist in her mouth and looked at the middle distance and made a sound that was not distress, but was an observation, some finding about the nature of the world that she was in the process of formulating. Outside the cabin the snow was still deep, but the angle of the light had changed. This was March. Spring would come. The mountain would be what the mountain was in spring, still enormous, still indifferent to human scale, but no longer pressing its indifference quite so actively, pulling back slightly as it always did in the turn of the season, giving an inch, giving the 3 feet of elevation that allowed the first green things to push through the remaining snow along the south-facing slopes. August Reed would walk those slopes in May and find the first growth and think, as he had not thought for 16 years, about what it meant that things came back. He would think about the letter. He would think about Ruth. He had read the letter enough times now that the paper had softened at the folds. He knew it well enough that thinking about it and reading it had become the same thing. Ruth had been exact in it. She had not wasted a word. That had always been her way. He would stand on the south slope in the May sunlight which is a different thing entirely from the December sunlight, and he would think about the mine, and he would think about what it meant to go in. He would go back to the cabin. Nora would be at the kitchen counter. Clara Ruth would be in the basket he had made not well, not expertly, but solidly, the basket that would hold her until she was too large for it, and then would hold other things, kindling probably, or the rolled bandaging from the medicine bag that now sat on the kitchen shelf, openly accessible in the place of a thing that was used rather than hidden. He would come through the door, and she would turn, and he would see her face, which he knew now, which he had been learning since November, which had its own language that he was becoming fluent in. She would say, "You're back." He would say, "Yes." And that would be the end of that sentence, and the beginning of whatever came next, which was not a story with a shape yet, which was still in the process of becoming whatever it was going to be, the way all living things are always in the process of becoming whatever they are going to be, unfinished, ongoing, moving through seasons that do not stop, because you are ready for them to pressing forward into territory that has not been mapped, because it is being made as you go one day at a time, one choice at a time, one open door at a time. The snow kept falling in the high country. The spring kept coming behind it, and in a cabin on this Bitterroot, in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and fresh bread, and the clean, cold air that came through a window cracked 2 inches. A woman and a man and a child who had not existed 4 months ago occupied the space that they had found their way to by roads that were not roads, through passes that were not marked, arriving somewhere that neither of them had been looking for, and both of them had needed. Outside the mountain, inside the fire. Between them, everything that gets built when people who have each stood outside their own closed doors, finally, imperfectly, with full understanding of the cost, choose to go in. End.